Welcome back again to our online lectures of economics. We are investigating some macroeconomic topics. We just covered GDP, we covered economic growth, we covered the business cycle, and now we're going to start talking about the twin problems associated with the business cycle. In other words, we have these economic expansions when GDP is growing, and it tends to be characterized by lots of jobs in the economy. So unemployment is typically not a problem when we're experiencing economic expansion. However, when we get sort of to the peak of that economic expansion, when we're at that phase where economic activity is occurring very rapidly, we typically have another economic problem, and that's called inflation. So we're going to be discussing unemployment and inflation in detail, and we're going to talk about how they relate to the business cycle. So this particular lecture, we actually are going to investigate unemployment first. All right, so we'll probably take at least one, if not two, lectures on unemployment. All right, so when we talk about the unemployment rate, so for instance, today is it's the end of May here in 2012, and the current unemployment rate in the United States is 8.2%. All right, so what does that mean, 8.2%? 8.2% of what? So to measure the unemployment of a country, you have to distinguish, when you look at all the citizens within the country, which members of a country, which citizens are actually in the labor force and which are not in the labor force. So we have a formula here. It says the unemployment rate equals those unemployed. Now, a good way to define someone who is unemployed is anyone who is actively seeking employment. So anyone actively seeking a job is unemployed, right? Over the entire labor force, and that would give you a decimal, right? Times 100, obviously that's going to change that into a percent. So that's your formula for the unemployment rate in the United States. So let's investigate who's actually in the labor force. So let's look at this we have. This is from 2007, so the exact numbers aren't quite as important as the theory here. All right. Let's look at the top group here of people who are not in the labor force. All right, and that would include all kids, so 16 years of age and younger, and then anyone who is institutionalized, right? So those people are not in the labor force. There's also this, so that's the lime green group up top there, and then you have this orangish color here. It just says not in the labor force, and in 2007 that was about 78 million people. Well, that would include the following groups. It would include anyone who's retired, who's simply not working anymore because they've reached an age where they don't need to work or they don't want to work anymore, right? Any stay-at-home mom or dads would be part of that group. Any full-time students in college would be part of that group, right? And then, if you were lucky enough to be independently wealthy where you didn't need to work, you'd be part of that group. And then the last part of that group are what we call discouraged workers. So if you're not actively seeking employment, you would be considered not in the labor force, right? So the way we go about calculating the unemployment rate is we divide the American population into those who are in the labor force versus those who are not in the labor force. So of the total population of roughly 303 million in 2007, right, you had 78 million in one group that are not in labor force, another 71 million in another group. So roughly half the U.S. population there not in the labor force. So that leaves two groups, which is easy enough to define. Anybody with a job. So if you are employed, you're obviously part of the labor force. And then, like I said earlier, anyone actively seeking employment, anyone looking for a job, right? Those people would be part of the labor force. So we just took these numbers right here and we plugged them into our formula, right? How many people are in the labor force? Well, you add up those people with jobs, 146 million, plus those people actively seeking employment, 7.1 million. That gives you a total labor force of 153 million people. So the unemployment rate would simply be 7.1 divided by 153, the entire labor force. So it would be the number of people looking for jobs, 7.1, the unemployed, divided by the entire labor force, 153 million people, right? And that would give you a decimal, and obviously you times that by 100, that'd give you the unemployment rate. Now, this unemployment rate is not a perfect statistic. Here are some problems with the current way we measure unemployment. Number one is part-time workers. So there are a lot of Americans, especially today, because we just on our way of recovering from what we call the Great Recession. Right, it was a pretty severe recession that started in late 2006, early 2007. So there's a lot of people today working maybe 20 or 30 hours who are ready, willing, and able to work 40 hours a week, but they simply are not required to work that much by their employers because there's not a huge demand for their services at this point. So if you are working part-time, if you're a part-time worker, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics counts you as employed, right? So that sort of understates the unemployment rate because those people would like to work more hours, right? So that's one part of the unemployment rate, which isn't a perfect measure. The next two are things that one I mentioned and one I haven't mentioned yet. Discouraged workers. So that group of people who has given up looking for a job. Right? So if you think about what happened during this last recession, think about the hundreds of thousands of people who lost their job and then they applied to 1, 10, 20, 100 jobs, and they don't even get any response. So after spending 6 months or a year actively seeking employment, they simply gave up because they were discouraged. They don't think there's any possibility of being hired in the current economic environment. So discouraged workers are not counted as unemployed because they're not actively seeking employment. So remember, when we define those people who are in the labor force, if you're not actively seeking employment, you're not part of the labor force. So discouraged workers, right? So that again, the current unemployment rate of 8.2%, that might not be a true measure of the real unemployment rate, right? And then you have these underemployed workers. Well, what does that mean? Well, think about what happens during a severe recession. Oftentimes people take any job they can because they need the money, right? They need the benefits perhaps for their family. So if you think a software engineer, she may have been making $150,000 at some extremely well-paying job in Silicon Valley prior to the recession, and then all of a sudden there's not a huge demand for those services currently. So she might take a job, managing a supermarket where her pay is a total of $58,000 a year. Now again, we're not making a normative decision here. We're not being critical of anyone's job. We're saying, her job skills, her skill set is much better than, it's much broader than working as manager in a supermarket. So if you think about our production possibility frontier, she's not fully employed because she has job skills that she simply isn't using. So we refer to those people as underemployed workers, people who take a job less than their skills just because they need the money. All right, so here's our unemployment rate again. All right, so one more quick review. The way we come up with the unemployment rate in the United States, and it's been done this way for a long time. Right? First, you have to figure out who's in the labor force, and that includes two groups: those people with jobs, plus those people actively seeking employment. Right? So to get the unemployment rate, we simply take those people actively seeking employment, the unemployed, divided by the total labor force, and that gives you your unemployment rate. What about different types of unemployment? Well, there are three types of unemployment. The first one is what we call frictional unemployment. And this is the least serious type of unemployment. And the reason why is because people who are frictionally unemployed, they actually possess job skills. So if you're frictionally unemployed, it's sometimes called voluntary unemployment. If you think about what happens, sometimes people leave a job simply because maybe they don't like their boss anymore, maybe they're bored, maybe they just want to pick up and move to a new town, and maybe their girlfriend got transferred to California and they're living in Pennsylvania and they want to try their hand at the West Coast. So it's somebody who possesses job skills, and sometimes economists refer to this as voluntarily unemployed, right? And this always happens because one of the economic goals of Chapter 1 is economic freedom, right? So this isn't like China or communist Soviet bloc where you're forced to work a job where you absolutely hate going to work. Now, of course, probably a decent amount of people who go to work that don't really love their job today, but they need the money or they need the benefits. But the nice thing about this country is there is some, a good deal of economic freedom, right? So frictionally unemployed people. Structural unemployment, the next type of unemployment, a little more serious, all right? And here's why. The structural unemployment means that something's happened in the economy where there's no longer a demand for the specific job skills that you possess, right? Economists refer to this idea of creative destruction, which means goods and services come in and out of favor, in and out of popular demand by people, and in and out of use. So, for instance, we don't want candles lighting our streets anymore. We have nice electric lights, right? And we don't want even CDs anymore. We want digital music players, right? We don't want cell phones that don't do internet anymore. So, if we think about what happens over time, this creative destruction, new products and services are constantly replacing older products and services, right? Which is good because a capitalist system is innovative, it's dynamic, right? It rewards those people who act on incentives, right? It constantly offers better goods and services for citizens within a society. But unfortunately, one of the byproducts of that creative destruction is that there's going to be a group of people who are working in those industries where there's no longer a demand for the good to produce or the service they were providing. So structural unemployment is more serious than frictional because structurally unemployed people need some type of job training, often need some type of refresher course, or maybe some community college classes to get up to snuff, to get up to par on some type of new job in the economy, right? Now, here's the reality about it. A capitalist system. Frictional unemployment and structural unemployment always exist, right? So we're going to talk about them as the natural rate of unemployment or the full employment number. So we'll talk about frictional and structural unemployment roughly being somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 5%, somewhere between 4 and 5% unemployment in the economy. So even if the economy is experiencing an expansion, if GDP is growing, if everything seems to be okay, there's still 4.2, 4.4% unemployment, right? It's a natural occurrence. And it's actually a good thing because of that economic freedom associated with frictional unemployment and the creative destruction associated with structural unemployment, right? Now, the next type of unemployment is more serious. This cyclical unemployment, right? And again, the name here tells you pretty much why it's titled as such, right? We are in the downward phase of the business cycle. In other words, the economy is in a recession. And because of the recession, there's no longer demand for goods and services. So there's a deficiency in what we call aggregate demand. Or an aggregate demand is a topic we're going to get into later in the course, but it's simply total spending by all participants in the economy. So if the economy is experiencing cyclical unemployment, then we are in a recession, right? And this is the most serious type of unemployment because oftentimes if cyclical unemployment is present, it means that the federal government or the Federal Reserve, right, the federal government would institute what's called fiscal policy, or the Federal Reserve, which carries out what's called monetary policy. All right, again, two economic concepts we're going to cover in detail later in the course. Right? If the economy is experiencing cyclical unemployment, then maybe some fiscal or monetary policy options are in place to address this cyclical unemployment. Right? All right, so here we have this term I said before, full employment, right? Full employment. So if there's no cyclical unemployment, right, there's always some level of unemployment anyway. So Milton Friedman was actually the first person to coin this phrase of full employment, and he basically pointed out to the post-World War II Keynesian economists, right, that it's actually a bad policy for any country, specifically the United States here, to try to achieve zero unemployment rate because it's never going to occur, because no matter what happens, there's always a degree of frictional unemployment and structural unemployment present in the economy. Those are unavoidable, right? So The natural rate of unemployment is another way of stating the exact same idea, right? The natural rate of unemployment. So, whether you hear it as the full employment number or the natural rate of unemployment, that refers to there's being just frictional and structural unemployment. All right, so what is the current natural rate of unemployment or the full employment number? All right, the first idea here is that the natural rate of unemployment or the full employment number, it used to be estimated to be somewhere around 6%. And today, most economists believe that the full employment number is somewhere between 4 and 5%. Just for sake of argument, we're going to talk about the full employment occurring at 5% for this course, right? But the question is, it's definitely come down over time. Why has it come down at least 1%? Right. One reason is because of the aging population, the aging labor force. We had the baby boomers are entering their their retirement years, so there's just fewer people in the labor force to start with. Right. Second idea is the idea of that years ago when you lost your job, it took you a while to maybe hook up with a new employer because the whole process of maybe going to find a newspaper and then going to go into interviews and such. Well, now we have two devices that quicken this pace. Obviously, the first one is the internet. You have job sites like Monster.com where you can have your resume up. Heck, you can have your resume up even before you lose your job, right? And then which was a wonderful idea, I'm sure, by somebody not that long ago. These temporary agencies. So if you're out of work and you need to do something to get some income, you can go down to a temp agency and take some type of job working for, whether it's a small, medium-sized, or large company. Right? So the aging population is temp agencies and the internet. Right? 1993, we had to pass the new welfare for work and these work requirements. So this has been an extremely successful program that the federal government passed. You can no longer stay on welfare indefinitely and just receive the benefits. You have to attempt to work somewhere where they taper down the benefit you're receiving. So this forces people to be a bit more responsible about themselves and to get back into the workforce. And then this one is a really depressing idea, but it's true. Is that since 1985, the U.S. prison population has actually doubled. Since 1985, the U.S. prison population has doubled, which means far fewer people in the labor force. All right. Well, what is the economic cost of unemployment? Well, some of it's pretty obvious, right? When we drew our production possibility frontier in Chapter 1, and we talked about a point inside the curve, we labeled that as, attainable but inefficient. Right? We could be having more pizzas and more robots, more consumer goods and more capital goods. So the first idea is simply foregone output. Right? We could be producing more of. Right? So how do we know what is our potential output? We're not reaching our potential output. And then is there any way we can mathematically calculate what's the actual cost of unemployment if we know the unemployment rate? Well, there was an economist who came up with this idea called the GDP gap. Right? And his name was Ocon and Ocon's law. Right? So here's what he did a lot of mathematical and statistical investigating of previous business cycles. And he says, okay, for every 1% that the actual unemployment rate is above the natural rate of unemployment, right? He said it creates a 2% GDP gap. All right, so I've come up with an example here for you. So let's use these numbers. So we're going to say that the natural rate of unemployment or the full employment number is 5%. Right? So the current in the current economy today, the actual unemployment rate is 8.2%. All right, so if you look at the examples, it's 8.2. Where do we get that? That's the reported unemployment rate today. So 8.2% unemployment. All right. Assuming a full employment number of 5%, 8.2 minus 5 is 3.2. So Ocon says if you take that 3.2, right, and you times it by 2, that tells you how much of a gap there is between our actual output, our actual GDP, versus our potential GDP. So the cost of foregone output, according to Ocon today, is roughly 6.4%. In other words, GDP should be 6.4% higher than it is. Now, be careful. It doesn't mean that the economy should be growing 6.4%. It's simply take the raw number of economic output, and it should be higher by 6.4%. So in the previous slide, we talked about Ocon's law, and we talked about actual GDP versus potential GDP. And here we see this data graphed over time, right? So identify what we're measuring here. Right, on the horizontal axis, right, we're measuring time from 1989 all the way through 2009. And on the vertical axis, we're simply measuring GDP in billions of dollars, or real GDP in billions of dollars. The red line represents potential GDP, potential economic output, right? So the red line represents potential GDP, right? And the blue line that goes up and down through it, that represents like actual GDP, right? Actual GDP. So you can see where every place where the blue line falls below the red line, we have a GDP gap, a negative GDP gap. In other words, that shows us how far we were falling, or we were falling short of our potential economic output. And then you look at this stretch in the 90s and say, whoa, what happens here? Right, where the blue line actually exceeds the red line, and says a positive GDP gap. Right? It's kind of interesting. You say it's like, so in that case, actual economic growth exceeded potential. It seems like some magic trick, right? How did actual economic growth exceed potential growth? By definition, doesn't the production possibility frontier represent the best we can do? Well, remember, we did assume a high degree of, or at least some degree of, frictional unemployment, right? That there's always some people who, well, in the 90s we had this economic boom based on computers, the internet, right? Improving technology and productivity because of computer-driven software and application of computers into production of goods and services. And the economy was churning along at an extremely quick pace. And salaries started to excel rather well. And what that does is that it brings into the labor market, into the workforce, all of those people who are frictionally unemployed. They either stay at their job because it's so well paying, or they don't stay unemployed very long because the cost of staying unemployed was quite high when new startups, B2B businesses, and internet businesses were offering $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 for people with a college degree but no experience just to come work for their internet company. Right? If you look all the way on the right-hand side of this graph, upward 2007 through 2009, you can see we have a significant GDP gap, a negative GDP gap up in that section, where actual GDP significantly fell short of potential GDP. Right? And that's basically the cost of this great recession to society. Alright, here are, for select countries from 1999 through 2009, so basically for a decade here, these are unemployment rates. Now, for a long period of time, the United States had much lower unemployment rates on average than the several big economies in Europe, Germany, France, and Italy. Right? Our unemployment rate skyrocketed during the Great Recession, right? But it is also coming down much quicker than these other European countries. Right? Japan had an even better record on the unemployment rate. Well, first let's talk about why the unemployment rate in the United States for the better part of a decade was roughly half that of Europe. Well, remember, incentives matter. The European system is a social welfare system with much more generous social benefits. So when people lose their job, right, they receive a much higher degree of their pay, and they receive a decent amount of benefits even when they're not working. So there's less incentive for people to go out and get rehired. The other aspect of this is that because of the structure of the system, businesses have to offer employees certain benefits and pay into the system for these employees. So there's less incentive for businesses to rehire people in these European countries.